Welcome. I was asked a little while ago to share some thoughts on working with grief and letting go. As usual, I try to start with some kind of a story, some kind of a joke, and I found there are very, very few really good jokes on grieving and letting go, understandably so. However, there's one of my classic favorite jokes, which, if you've been listening over the years, you've probably heard this one before, but I think it bears retelling. It's the story of an old, old man on his deathbed. He's surrounded by his very best friend and all his other friends. They've been drinking buddies their whole life. They know each other really, really well. And the old man knows that his time is coming soon, and all his friends are sitting around the room, his best friend right by his side, and he gestures to his friend. His friend comes in close, and all the other friends lean in a little bit, and he says, I want you to know that there's a case of Scotch malt whiskey in my basement behind the furnace. And I'm wondering, as part of the grieving process, every year on my birthday, would you be willing to take a bottle of that malt whiskey and just pour it over my grave? His friend bursts out in tears and says, of course, anything you want. We'll be honored to do that. And one of his friends taps him on the shoulder and excuses himself, and they all go and they huddle in a corner of the room. Pretty intense discussion. His friend comes back to his side and he leans and he says, again with tears in his eyes, we would be honored to do that. The question we have is, would you mind terribly if we pass that whiskey through our kidneys first? Again, hard to find jokes on grieving. But as we've been exploring the topic of inquiry, kind of the power of questions, I thought I might explore this really important topic through the lens of the questions that you can explore. What I'd like to talk about first, again, in 4 parts, is usually my standard approach. What did the Buddhists say about grieving? Well, what are the classic teachings about grieving and working with loss? The next question is, how can you be with grief when it's here for a visit? The third, what is this art of mindfully letting go? How do we let go? And finally, how might we live fully, particularly in these incredibly challenging times, knowing that we too are destined to fall away? Well, when it comes to some of the classic teachings, there's probably the best known story about grief and healing and letting go. It was the story back in the Buddhist time of a woman who had an only son, and her son died. And she could not let him go. In fact, as the story goes, she went from house to house with her son's body, asking for help. So bereft with grief. And someone directed her to see the Buddha. And she went to the Buddha and said, I've heard everything about what a wonderful teacher you are. And if you can do anything, I want you to bring my son back. The Buddha, of course, saw the depth of her grief. And he said, all you have to do is bring me just a few mustard seeds, which were very, very common. But they must come from a house that death and grief has not touched. And so with great determination, she set out. All she had to do was accomplish this one task. And she went from house to house to house to house on this long personal quest to find a house where death and loss had not arrived. And as you can imagine, every house she went to, people spoke of death. They spoke of their loss. They spoke of their grief. She met many people who lost children just as she had. And as you can imagine, she was transformed when she realized that there is no one who has not been touched by loss and by the accompanying grief that comes with it. This story can be helpful, but it doesn't necessarily touch on how we truly let go. But it does speak toward this very, very powerful teaching of equanimity. Equanimity, or the sense of steadiness in the midst of change, is considered really the flower of these practices. All that we do in these practices of concentration, arriving, developing that sense of preferenceless awareness, of cultivating kindness, compassion, joy, they all can point toward this sense of this vast spaciousness where we are present in the face of impermanence. Kind of the classic teaching, one of the classic practices, is to imagine a mountain. And you might, just for a few moments, as a little Zen pop quiz, if you will, if you like, you can close your eyes. And imagine your body as a mountain. And you might even think of like your favorite mountain, if you have a favorite mountain. And just imagine your body now, perfectly still. You might slow down the breath, smooth out the breath. And imagine your face now expressionless, like a mountain face. And imagine as the mountain, the changing of the seasons, the winter, ice, snow, hail, sleet. Imagine the arising of spring, the flowering. Imagine the movement into summer, the green of grasses, of trees, moving into fall, seeds forming, and moving again into winter. The seasons come and go. The weather systems come and go, and yet the mountain remains. The sense of equanimity. It's a quality within you that is untouched by things that change. You might deepen your breath. If you like, you can open your eyes if they were closed. When it comes to acknowledging grief and loss, the teachings are kind of tricky because we have this teaching of equanimity, of being aware of impermanence, not being touched by things that change. But at the same time, that points toward a sense of like, well, then loss I shouldn't be touched by loss. I should simply see it as a changing season. But this is where it gets complicated. We're also taught to be present to what is, to be intimately present to what is here. And we're also taught to bring kindness and empathy and compassion to the moment. So it becomes this paradox, to be intimately present to that which is here, and at the same time to see it as impermanent, as changing. Part of how I articulate this for myself, and this is just me talking, In any given experience, whether it be a strong emotion of loss or whether it be just awareness of fleeting thoughts, is to neither indulge nor deny. Very, very tricky. When, let's say, grief and the pain of loss is present, don't pretend it isn't happening. But at the same time, notice if you're holding on. Like any emotion, grief can feel like a permanent state. It feels like it's never going to change. And you may have noticed that the more you resist, the more it will persist. So we can see grief as a series of contractions and expansions. There's the pain of holding on, the contraction, and then the accepting of loss, which opens us up and we feel the expansion. Ultimately, I think these practices are about reality, coming in contact with reality, and grief is real. Pain, the pain of loss is real. And I'm sure as you have gone through loss in your life, is very much like the stages of a relationship to death. Not in any particular order, but denial, anger, bargaining, depression. Eventually, acceptance and finding a sense of deeper meaning. And our culture, and maybe it's not just our culture, maybe it's our species, we generally try to move through unpleasant experiences as quickly as possible, particularly when it comes to loss and grief. If you ever lost someone dear to you, chances are you've gotten some responses from people, some skillful, some not so skillful. Some of the things to refrain from saying when you're with someone who has had loss, or maybe you've experienced someone saying this to you. Here are some examples. Oh, she's in a better place now. At least he's no longer suffering. There's a reason for everything. I know how you feel. And God wanted her to be with him. Or be strong. And this is simply a reflection of how we relate to pain and loss. The fixing, the rationalizing, the minimizing, the sense of putting timelines on loss. And we do this with pain. We'll try to compartmentalize it, rationalize it, nuke it. And if it isn't fully healed or processed, there's a tremendous price that we pay if we turn away from it. Grief and loss we normally associate with our loved ones, but when we broaden this out to where we are in our lives now, climate change, the loss of species, of habitat, the suffering that's here and now, and by all indications is going to get more chronic. The loss of integrity in our culture, the light that's being shined on systemic racism and suppression of non-dominant cultures. This collective grief that we're holding, if it isn't processed, it simply goes deeper. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow said, "There is no grief like the grief that does not speak." And Victoria Alexander wrote this: "There are three needs of the griever: to find the words for the loss, to say the words aloud, and to know that the words have been heard." And this speaks so beautifully to healing and speaks so beautifully to how we can be with grief. There's another story from the Buddha's time, at the time of his death, that many of the monks who were surrounding the Buddha were deeply distraught, deeply emotional, strong vocalization of emotions. And others said, no, stop that. Your grieving is about attachment, and everything the Buddha taught us was to let go of anything we're identified with, anything we're holding on to. So that's kind of confusing. On the one hand, we are told in this practice to notice what you're holding on to and let it go. Don't be identified, don't be attached. On the other hand, it's about acknowledging what's here in the moment with compassion and empathy. There's another story from the 18th century of a student who was the student of a famous Zen master. When Sachujo, a great disciple of Hakuin, was old, she lost her granddaughter, which grieved her very much. An old man from the neighborhood came and admonished her, "Why are you wailing so much? If people hear this, they'll all say, oh, this old lady once studied with Hakuin and was enlightened. So now why is she mourning her granddaughter so much? You ought to lighten up a bit." Satsujo glared at her neighbor and scolded him. "You bald-headed fool, what do you know? My tears and weeping are better for my granddaughter than incense, flowers, and lamps." The old man left without a word. So the question becomes, how do we grieve mindfully? How do we grieve fully, knowing that all things are destined to change and fall away? You might, again, if you like, take a moment to close your eyes, and you might just take a few slow breaths. And you might, in these few moments, just explore the following question. What have you lost in this life? What relationships have you, those you've known well, who are no longer here? What material losses have you experienced? What dreams or plans have you lost? And what have you learned from these losses? If you like, you can, again, deepen your breath. You can open your eyes. Khalil Gibran said, "Unless you love and grieve fully, you will cry, but not all your tears, and laugh, but not all your laughter." There is something about making room for our human experience, to accept the cycles of grief. And Lamott said, "You will lose someone you can't live without, and your heart will be badly broken. And the bad news is you never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that doesn't seal back up. And you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly. It still hurts when the weather gets cold, but you learn to dance with the limp. So perhaps we learn to dance with the limp. And this process of grieving and letting go is this delicate dance of wisdom, of seeing clearly into the nature of reality, and compassion, of softening and letting go. So how do we let go? many years back, gosh, almost 15 years ago, my dog, who was just shy of 15 years old, wonderful, amazing, amazing dog, was at the end of his life. He had pretty much used up his body. And I was away on a meditation retreat, and word got to me that he was at the vet's and didn't have much time left. So I left the retreat to race home to say goodbye and be there for his passing. He passed peacefully, and I returned back to the retreat where I had 5 days in silence. And it became this very profound, I'll use the word opportunity, to investigate and be with grief. I'd raised this guy from a puppy and walked him twice a day for 15 years, and we knew each other relatively well. I know that grief comes in rogue waves. And by rogue waves, I mean that there is this sense of spaciousness, and then there's some trigger, maybe a story or a smell or some association, and then the wave begins to build. And the wave, if you will, it's really comprised of three things. There's sometimes a mental quality to it, a story. There's sometimes an emotion, which is kind of a feeling that goes with the story. But at its base is it's energetic. There's just sort of a feeling tone. My resolution for those 5 days was that when a rogue grief wave came, that my task was to stay on the wave until I couldn't find it. And so at different times, the wave would come, and it would be just the ache in my heart or the clench in my belly or the lump in my throat. And it would build, and it would build, and maybe there'd be a story with it, maybe not. And my intention was to stay on the wave, and the wave would crest, and then the wave would recede. Days. And I was astonished. I was truly astonished by simply staying on the wave when it was there, how quickly it moved from the clutch of loss to the joy of what we shared. Now, I was very, very lucky because I had the optimal space to do this work. But can you imagine for yourself that when you feel a grief wave, that you could give it space, that you could ride that wave, let it get as big as it could, and then watch how it might change? And I think this is part of the art of letting go. Just as we learn to compartmentalize our roughest feelings, we can learn to make room for them. So just as someone can offer something unskillful for you when you're suffering or feeling loss, there's some very powerful things that you can offer someone when they're undergoing loss. Simply to say, I'm so sorry. I hope you feel surrounded by love right now. I just want you to know I'm sending you lots of love. Or, I don't know how you feel, but let me know if there's anything you need. Or to give a hug instead of saying anything. Or not to say anything, but just to offer a presence. And just as when we try to control and compartmentalize, when we open for another who's suffering or for ourselves, it's about not fixing. It's about turning to feelings and presence. It's about admitting that we can't make it better. It's about recognizing loss, and maybe most importantly, it's recognizing that grief and loss and making room is not time limited. You know, we have such deep fear of loss, of death. And there is a certain paradox of moving closer toward that which we fear. I always like to kind of offer that it's just been so helpful for me that when we encounter something difficult, that's not about figuring it out, it's about getting familiar with. As the Buddha said, familiarity leads to wisdom. And I've had, and I really honor the word, the privilege of being with a number of people as they've experienced their last exhalation. I grew up on a farm and I worked on farms, so of course being around countless animals. But when I was in college, a neighbor who had a heart attack, of being with him on his last breath. Someone I befriended who had an advanced medical condition and being his caretaker toward the end. And my father, accompanying my father through his last breaths. And what so surprised me, is kind of that which I'd feared the most of being with someone as their spirit left their body. Because I was there, the finality and the reality of that experience of watching the transition of that last breath and feeling the life force leave the body was one of the most healing things in terms of letting go and grief. If I wasn't there, there's, I guess, some kind of imagining that I would have had, but to actually be there on the in breath and on the out breath and actually feel that transition and to get how ultimately utterly natural the process is was a tremendous boon. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says that dying is nothing to fear. It can be the most wonderful experience of your life. It all depends on how you've lived. Which brings up the last thing I'd like to just share a little bit around. Knowing that all this is going to change, knowing all this is going to fall away, how do we choose to live? And there's something interesting here about what's called anticipatory grief. Just as I accompanied my dog at the end of his days, Tara and I have another dog who's now about 15 years old. And she's deaf. She's got impaired sight. She winces when she lies down. She no longer wants to go out for any walks. And there is this sense of anticipatory grief, just knowing that her time is coming. And while that can be morose, there are two sides to every coin. Knowing that her time is limited has opened up this incredible space of really celebrating what's here. I'd read the story a long time ago of this guy whose beagle was in his last days, and his commitment was best day ever. You know, just making every day the best day ever. And our dog has a lot of joy, particularly around food. Food and touch. But it's the remembering. And again, this is such an integral part of these practices that the word sati means to remember. This practice of breath The in-breath coming into a new moment, the out-breath of falling away. Anapanasati is the Pali term for breath-based meditation. It's remembering this breath, remembering the here and now, remembering the impermanence. Which brings us to the power of remembering. The 5 daily remembrances is kind of a classic teaching that goes back. Some traditions recommend thinking about this every day. I know quite a few people who do this formally. I'd say I do it more informally. But let me just share these with you. If you like, you can close your eyes. There are different translations. This is one of them, more kind of vernacular English. You might feel your breath again. I am sure to become old. I have not gone beyond aging. I am sure to become ill. I cannot avoid illness. I am sure to die. I have not gone beyond death. I will be separated from all that is dear and beloved to me. I'm the owner of my actions. I am heir to my actions. Whatever actions I do, good or bad, these I will inherit. If you like, you can deepen the breath. If you like, you can open the eyes. So what is the benefit of reminding yourself that you're going to get old, that you're going to get sick, that you're going to die, that everything you love is going to fall away, and that all you really have is what you do? Everything you do, you will inherit. That remembrance can be a very powerful doorway to celebrating your life. It can become an incredible doorway to embracing what's here, meeting the moment with the clarity of clear seeing, but also having access to this incredible sense of compassion, of empathy. Again, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These people have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills with compassion, gentleness, and a deep loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. You know, it's hard not to listen to the news and fall into a sense of dread and anticipatory grief. I've recently kind of been turned on to bird song. There's an incredibly cool app called Merlin HD, and you can record bird song and it'll identify the birds around you. It's just amazing. And so one of my favorite things is when I'm paddling on the river to kind of float by the islands, and we're in peak migration here, here in May, and to just take in the incredible variety of birds that are here in Northern Virginia right now. And that sense of the joy of nature and its many, many expressions. It kind of heightens the anticipatory grief around what is inevitably going to occur with climate change. The species that are dying off We are in a period of dying off right now. The millions of people who will be displaced and will be suffering through climate change. And to feel the pressure of limited resources and how it affects nationalism and brings up a deeper sense of polarization. The incredible grief from those I know who are of the non-dominant culture who are feeling the hatred coming toward them. All of this sense of grief calls on two things. And it's almost impossible sometimes to access it. But it calls on being the mountain, being that sense of timeless presence, awake to impermanence, awake to what is changing, acknowledging falling away, acknowledging loss, acknowledging the cycles of life, but also to be there with loving presence for all that arises, in the joy of life and the sorrow of life. To make room for that with kindness, compassion, and empathy. It's so easy to get off that middle way, either to move into the dispassion, the indifference of the mountain, or to be consumed in the fire of the suffering. The remembering that all this is changing, that you will disappear along with everyone you know and love, can bring us back to the reality of here and now. In this remembering, I had a great moment. This is years ago. It's time for a Dharma talk. And I said to Tara, to my wife, I said, I got nothing. I don't think I have anything to say. You got any advice? And she said, yeah. She said, if this was your last talk, what would you want to say? That was so helpful. And quite often I remember that when I'm writing a talk. If this was my last talk, what would I want to say? And when I remember that, which is really not that often, when I'm with someone, if this was my last moment with this person, what would I want to say? What would I want them to know? To me, this points toward the possibility of opening to loss and to grief. It gives us the opportunity to be fully present in our lives, to acknowledge that which we love and to speak it, to say it. I'm incredibly grateful to share these practices with you. I hope this has been helpful. I'd like to offer a final meditation as we close here in these final moments. And I'd like to share with you just two very, very short readings. You might, as you like, let your eyes close. Taking these moments to acknowledge you have not gone beyond death. You have not gone beyond aging. You have not gone beyond getting ill. Acknowledging that everything that is dear and delightful will one day vanish. Acknowledging that you are the result of your actions You are the creator of your actions. And you might bring into mind someone dear to you that you have lost. And as you sense their presence, you might acknowledge how their presence has impacted you. And you might feel or acknowledge yourself as the mountain, this changeless presence, awake and aware of all that falls away. And sensing as well this quality of loving presence, the capacity to hold everything and anything that may arise, to make room for the rogue waves of grief. And as you reflect on this one person, just letting the following words just resonate, pass through your awareness. They're quite brief. First from Rumi. Your body is away from me, but there is a window open from my heart to yours. From this window, like the moon, I keep sending news secretly. And these words from W.S. Merwin. Your absence has gone through me like a thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. You might, in your own time, gently let your breath deepen. If you like, you can let your eyes open. It's been said that so much of our life and our practice is about expanding our capacity to make room for the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows. I hope these practices have been helpful for you. I wish you well in your journey. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And I look forward to being with you again. Happy trails.